Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Tip of the Ice-Burgh podcast, your home for Pittsburgh Penguins news and analysis. You can find us on YouTube at Tip of the Ice-Burgh or anywhere you get your podcast from. I'm your host, Nick Belsky, joined as always by Nick Horwat. We got a great show for you guys today. First and foremost, the Pittsburgh Penguins have a massive decision to make with left-handed defenseman Marcus Pettersson. We'll talk about what that decision is and what we would do if we were in Kyle Dubas's shoes. And speaking of Kyle Dubas's shoes, we look back on the one-year anniversary of the Erik Karlsson trade. What were our thoughts in year one? What can we expect in year two of EK65 with the Penguins? And we'll close things out by crowning the top 5 moments of Sidney Crosby's career on the eve of his 37th birthday. Should be a good show for you guys. Let's get started. And let's start things off with that massive decision, looking at the future for the Pittsburgh Penguins with Marcus Pettersson. The Penguins, he's due an extension. He's eligible an extension as of right now. Going into a contract year in the 2024-25 season, we've had really only one update, and this comes from Pittsburgh Hockey Now, basically saying the Penguins are open to an extension, or at the very least, they've opened up trade discussions. Here's the exact quote from Pittsburgh Hockey Now. Quote, PHN has learned the Penguins have discussed a new contract, or at least broached the subject of a new deal with Pettersson, but further talks are on hold until the most significant issue is resolved. Now, they reference that most significant issue being the Sidney Crosby contract, which we talked about last week, and shoot, maybe we get some news on tomorrow based on what the day is. But as of right now, seems like they've opened the door for Marcus Pettersson, but they haven't necessarily ran through it and ramped up discussions. What are your thoughts on the Penguins' current dilemma with left-handed defenseman Marcus Pettersson?
It's an interesting one. Everyone is well aware that Marcus Pettersson is probably the best defensive defenseman that the Penguins have in the organization right now. He's filled in for Brian Dumoulin quite easily. I mean, sure, the last few years with Dumoulin weren't great in Pittsburgh, but someone had to step up and essentially take the reins of what he was able to do in his in Dumoulin's best years. And Pettersson's been able to do that, and not only that, but add a bit of a puck-moving ability to it. Not that Dumoulin wasn't a good puck mover, but Marcus Pettersson, I kind of feel, has that extra level of it. It's not that much of an extra level, but when you play quite often with guys like sharing ice with Erik Karlsson or Chris Letang, that helps a lot from your own blue line partner being that offensively skilled. And then just some of the forwards that he gets paired up with too. They are able to help Marcus Pettersson gain a bunch of points. So they're in an interesting spot because of the situation the entire organization is in, that things are just lining up pretty almost awkwardly for Pettersson, right? It's just the way this contract is ending at this specific season, at a pivotal turning point almost for the Penguins as a whole.
Yeah, you mentioned his offensive skill set. He set a career-high 30 points in the 2023-24 season, playing a lot of time and a lot of those points coming from Erik Karlsson. But you look at where the Penguins are at, and you mentioned it. It's the unspoken word of the Penguins this offseason, as Jeff Taylor likes to call it, the donut or the bagel, whatever it is, one of those two breakfast treats. Basically, they don't want to say it's a rebuild, but all their moves indicate it's a rebuild. And if you're rebuilding, this might be your biggest trade piece. It is Marcus Pettersson as a rental on the expiring contract. He's one of the better defensive defensemen, not just for the Penguins, but really across the National Hockey League. I would be hard-pressed to find a team that he wouldn't be their top left-handed defenseman, or at the very least, their top defensive defenseman, and certainly top 4 on all 32 NHL teams. But you look at where he's at, he might want a new contract now. Do you give him a new contract, or do you look at him as, hey, this is a trade piece that at the very least we need to go into this season with you as potentially being a trade piece and then work our way from there?
I think it's the latter. I think you do have to go into this season essentially with him expiring, with Marcus Pettersson expiring, because you're going to get the Crosby contracts signed, sealed, delivered. You're going to wrap that up, no doubt. But then where do you go from there as the Penguins organization? Like we keep saying, they don't want to say they're in a rebuild, but quietly it's what it seems. And with that comes, well, let's just see what this season what comes with this season, because this team could very well still find a way to be competitive. No one knows how any season is going to turn out until the puck is dropped, until games are being played. That's why you play all 82. Once the Penguins are about 15, 20 games in, they might know, maybe even 25, they might kind of get a feel for what sort of team they're going to be down the stretch. And if it's not competitive, if it's not, setting up to be a good season, then you start looking at your upcoming UFAs. And he's one of them. He's going to be the big one. And you start to see what could be out there for Marcus Pettersson in return, because now you're building for the future. That's the kind of deal you're probably not going to attempt to make it a hockey move. You're going to try and get a pick, get a prospect, and build for what could be the coming seasons. But if you're 20, 30 games in and the Penguins look good, they're fighting for playoff spots early, they're in that niche position of by the Thanksgiving break, if they are in this spot, then maybe they can do something. Then you look at it as, okay, let's try and work on something. But then you get into the struggle of, well, what kind of deal is it going to be? Again, the Penguins are still on that verge of something not good, of not catastrophic, but the downfall. And does he want to be here for that? Does he want to take a short-term deal to maybe kick this can down the road another season or two? As he's hitting his prime, it's tough to tell. So they're in quite a pickle with it. And I'd say you have to go into the season without a deal, though. That's like the long and the short of it.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, I'll do another long and the short of it. The one thing you cannot do is you cannot let him walk next summer for nothing. Either you re-sign him or you trade him. There's no letting him walk in the summer. It is imperative that if you're not going to get him back, that you have to get something in return for him. And if you don't, you're just slowing down your rebuild. That's what you're doing. And honestly, we talk about him specifically because outside of Crosby and Malkin and Letang and Karlsson, who we all agree are unlikely to, almost impossible to be moved, or that unlikely that they will be or even want to, Pettersson is their best name. He's their biggest piece. And I agree with you. I think you go into the year, I think you give it a little bit longer simply because this is Marcus Pettersson we're talking about. He's not going to command as much as a top line left winger. He's not. But I think you look at this, and by the turn of the new year, you make that decision. Hey, is this team as constructed good enough to be a playoff team and potentially a team that could win a series and make some noise? If they are, you don't trade away Marcus Pettersson, because that leaves you with Matt Grzelcyk and Ryan Graves. And maybe by that time, one or both of them has stepped up and kind of gotten out of the public perception of what they are going into the season. They're not going to reach the level that Marcus Pettersson automatically is at going into the season. I don't think that by December is where you're going to see those guys. So I say by the turn of the new year, you have to see where you're at, and where you're at determines the direction you go on with Marcus Pettersson.
Yeah, a lot of times I would say you can get away with letting certain players walk, especially at the kind of price range that Pettersson is at. Like, you can let a player that's at $4 million kind of walk to free agency, and because it's not like you're losing him for nothing. You're gaining that much money in salary cap space. The issue with the Penguins is the situation that they're in is how valuable really is salary cap space if they are heading toward a rebuild. It's not. So you may as well get something in return. So I see what you're saying there. And for what it's worth, you're saying by the turn of the new year, you know what that would do? Line up perfectly with the last time Marcus Pettersson signed a contract on January 28th, 2020. Of course, before a pandemic broke out. So we don't worry about what happened in the immediate future there. But he's worked out a deal. The Penguins and Pettersson have worked out a deal in the middle of a season before.
Yeah.
This is no new thing. It wouldn't be any new thing for him. And that just depends on what the team looks like, what he believes the team can be, and what the team believes they can be. He signed a 5-year deal. It depends also what he's looking for.
Yeah.
At the age of 28, is he looking for the 7 to 8 years? Is he looking for a long term to cash out and call it a career somewhere? Is he looking to maybe take a 1-year deal and go from there? I apologize for the dogs. They seem to want Marcus Pettersson around.
Yeah, they're very passionate on this subject. And honestly, I'll have to ask them this question off air as well. But earlier this summer, I put together a contract projection for Marcus Pettersson based on simply him and the market surrounding left shot defensemen that are similar to him, defensive defensemen. And what I came up with was 6 years, $5.713 million per season. Now, Horwat, I'll ask you this before we move on to Erik Karlsson. If you were Kyle Dubas, would you sign that deal if it was in front of you? 6 years, $5.713 million for Marcus Pettersson.
6 years, I don't know if I would. That's a little long, especially considering the situation. Like I keep mentioning that the Penguins are in this nearing that rebuild, nearing that decline. So it could get interesting. 6 years just feels long. The money, right on, though. I think that's about what he's going to make, whether it's here or somewhere else.
Yeah, whenever I look at that, I say, how committed am I to this rebuild if I'm Kyle Dubas? If I'm super committed to having this rebuild done, then I trade him, because at the end of the day, what you're getting back from him is going to help you get better holistically by, 3 or 4 years down the road. But at the same time, you need to keep some players around, right? And Malkin's likely done after the 2025-26 season. Erik Karlsson, who knows where he goes after this 2-year sprint for the Penguins. Chris Letang turns into a modified no trade clause. Same goes for Brian Rust. So how many people? You have to keep somebody. And if you're looking at the Penguins defensive side of things, Marcus Pettersson seems like one of the guys you would keep, because if he signs that 6-year deal, that's right around the end of Kyle Dubas's first contract that he signed last year, 7 years. And you have to imagine that his plan was give the team as good of an opportunity the next couple of years to win. But also by the end of that first contract, he wants to be able to have said, hey, the worst part of the rebuild is over. We're back on our way up with a younger team. You need to have somebody there that shows the ropes to the young guys. And I think Marcus Pettersson could be that. So again, that's my one partial thought of maybe you keep him around to be that shepherd for these young defensemen coming up, your Owen Pickerings, your Emil Pieniniemis if he comes over, your Isaac Belivos if he's able to make strides, and whoever else you bring in the meantime over the next couple of years. But you need somebody on that left side. Matt Grzelcyk is 30, and he's not it. Ryan Graves has a lot of time left on that contract, but from what he showed last year, he is not it. Marcus Pettersson's been the real deal. So, to a certain extent, I say if that's the deal at my feet, like you mentioned, salary cap space is not really going to be much of an issue for a rebuilding team in 3 years. I signed that deal.
And that's fair too. It's not like it's an unfair deal at all, especially whenever you lay it out in that way of shepherding the young guys into the future. It's going to be something to keep an eye, especially if this veteran team. I mean, Chris Letang may still be around, but in certain aspects, but also the way Rob Rossi lays out that 2-year plan almost. Will Chris Letang still be around? Erik Karlsson will be, maybe. At the end of 2 years, who knows if you go to him and say, hey, it's teardown season. I know you don't want to get moved again, but, let's get you that Stanley Cup, buddy, especially if it doesn't come in the next 2 seasons here.
Yeah, especially going into a contract year, which I believe it would be for Erik Karlsson after these next 2 seasons. Speaking of Erik Karlsson, let's move over and talk about that, because it is actually the 1-year anniversary of the Erik Karlsson trade. 1 year ago today, on August 6th of 2023, the Penguins acquired Erik Karlsson, Rem Pitlick, and Dylan Hamaliuk in exchange for Mikael Granlund, Jan Ruda, a 2024 first-round pick that was eventually used to be traded up for the Sharks to get Sam Dickinson in this year's draft. They also sent Casey DeSmith, Jeff Petrie, a 2025 second-rounder, and prospect Nathan Legare to the Montreal Canadiens. So 1 year ago today, if you look back on it, what are your thoughts on the Erik Karlsson trade after 1 calendar year?
After 1 year, I'm still looking at it as a pretty solid deal for the Penguins. I mean, they dumped a lot of things off, a lot of what people would say were Ron Hextall masterclasses to pick up the future Hall of Fame defenseman. On the surface, that's a good start. I understand that Erik Karlsson may not have had the ideal season. I get that expectations were, depending on who you ask, maybe a little overstated, but he didn't meet any of the minimum expectations, at least for the start of the season. As things got rolling near the end, whenever the team was really picking things up, he himself did as well. But at the end of the day, looking back at a year, you wish it had been better, but I think there's room for improvement. He's an awesome guy. He's an awesome character to have in the locker room too. He's obviously one of the best talents in the world at his position, and just needs another chance to prove that in a new uniform. The personality isn't going to go anywhere. He's one of the best guys in the room to deal with. He's one of the best guys in the room, period. And once things start translating on the ice into a bit of a better degree, it's going to end up looking like a Kyle Dubas masterclass in no time.
Yeah, obviously missing the postseason right after doing that, giving away a first-round pick, and then essentially making moves to say you're rebuilding, it's gonna make it look a little worse looking back on it at this point, because right now we're talking about the rebuild or the bagel, whatever you want to call it, and the Penguins could have probably used a lottery pick this past year, that 14th overall selection, which eventually became the 11th overall selection for the San Jose Sharks. But at the same time, you look at what Karlsson was at the end of the year. If he was that for maybe 10% more of the season, the Penguins are probably a playoff team last year, because at the end of the year, Erik Karlsson was, as anticipated, as expected, very good for the Penguins. And I know some people will highlight some of the mistakes that he made down the stretch. It's Erik Karlsson. And if you're, expecting that to go away, then you just don't understand how he plays, and you just haven't been paying attention for his entire career. He's going to make those mistakes, but he was at his best down the stretch. And I think the fact that it took longer than anticipated for him to adjust and get to that moment is the most disappointing part. Maybe not the points total. He finished with 56. You would have hoped that he had more, and we'll talk about expectations for next year. But I think the one thing that was most disappointing is how long it took him to adjust to being in Pittsburgh, to playing with, I guess part of that is playing with Pettersson, but also playing with Graves, but also being moved around a lot. I think those are the biggest disappointments in year one for Erik Karlsson. But still, 1 year later, you look back at the trade, and knowing where they were at the time, it's a solid deal for Kyle Dubas, even if it didn't pan out in the first season.
Yeah, that's why it's a multi-year thing to look at. I don't know how else to put it. You have a couple years with this future Hall of Famer to really see what he can do, and just know the expectations are going to be higher. You now have a new baseline almost to grow from. He came in with off of a 101 point season. Just from that, the expectations are going to be a little elevated. They're going to be a bit outrageous, considering it was a historic season. But, I forget what we had placed it at when he arrived, but it certainly wasn't 56. But now, another year older with some higher expectations, some higher hopes for him at least, maybe not as the whole team, you're thinking 56 to 60 should be the baseline almost, and going from there. Especially if he's playing with Marcus Pettersson all season and not getting, he was pretty steady with Pettersson, but with the rest of the defense getting hit with the shuffle button pretty often, it shook things up quite a bit. So if he's able to have a consistent winger or a consistent line mate with him, like Marcus Pettersson, there should be some good chemistry going on with Erik Karlsson, who should see improvement in year two in Pittsburgh.
Yeah, I mean, on top of that, it's just a second year playing with Marcus Pettersson, not just playing with Pettersson more in total, but the fact that they played together a lot of last year. They also played over in the World Championships for Team Sweden. That was a dominant Team Sweden up until the knockout stages. So I'm excited. This kind of dips into the expectations for year two that we were going to get to. When you look at his point total, which I think is what a lot of people are going to judge him based on, at least the majority of the fan base is going to judge him based on point production. Last year with that 56 was disappointing. But if you look at his career points per game average, it's 0.815. I think that's around where he finishes again this year, especially if he stays healthy. I could see him between 65 and 70 points, and that's what my expectations are. Last year, it was between 75 and 80. I was saying maybe he can get close to being a point per game player again. This year, another year older, based on the team that's around him and the fact that they have a lot of heavy lifting to do on the power play to get that back to a respectable number, I'm going to put it between 65 and 70. I think that would be a tremendous year for Erik Karlsson in 2024-25, and I think the Penguins would be in pretty good position if they get that out of him.
Yeah, that's pretty much exactly where I would have put it as well. Just right in that sort of vicinity of points. And maybe even if, let's say, it's unlikely. Let's say he finds a nice step defensively too, which I think in the early goings of the season, I think everyone sort of thought he was going to have, and then that filtered away pretty quickly. So it's going to be about offense. It's going to be about scoring points, and then maybe quarterbacking one of the power play units.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we'll see what type of impact having David Quinn back is going to have on him, because you look at David Quinn, he has a proven track record with several top defensemen. I mean, obviously, specifically with Erik Karlsson in that season that you referenced in 2022-23 when he won the Norris Trophy, when he scored the most points in 30 years by a defenseman. But he also was there for the early years, David Quinn was, at least in New York, of Adam Fox. So you're hoping for him to come in and kind of pick up where he left off with Karlsson, and also aid Chris Letang in that aspect as well. I mean, Quinn is going to be in charge of the defense. He's going to be in charge of revitalizing this power play. So a lot of what Erik Karlsson's season is going to be up to how well he and David Quinn can really come in, get back on the right foot right away, and kind of disperse that throughout the blue line.
Sorry, I wasn't ready for you, but yeah, that's going to be the pretty essential, starting point for Erik Karlsson this upcoming season.
Yeah, the last thing I'll say about Karlsson, because we've talked about his point total, we've talked about what was disappointing about last year. The power play is going to be massive this year for the Penguins. If it's good, last year they're in the playoffs. It was historically bad, and they missed the playoffs by 3 points in the last week of the season. The question I have for you is, do you see Erik Karlsson doing the thing that we wanted him to do all year last year? Do you think he takes charge now that he's had his feet underneath him, that he's played with guys like Crosby and Malkin for a full season? Do you think that will give him the opportunity, especially with the confidence of having David Quinn behind him now, to be able to say, hey, I am the guy on this power play. Those guys are Hall of Famers. Those guys are great, but this is my power play unit to run, because I think that's what they need to have happen for them to find some success. You're muted also, by the way. I think you double tapped.
I missed the button. Oh, I'm having a great day. Yeah, I do think this absolutely can be that year for him to take over. It might take a conversation with Chris Letang as well to take a bit of a step back, but I mean, act like that conversation didn't start last season.
Yeah.
He played every game, if I'm not mistaken. But it's still something that needs to be addressed in general. Just, hey, this is the point of everyone's career right now. Chris Letang's a year older. Sid and Gino are each a year older. Yeah, Erik Karlsson's a year older too, but he is A, younger, and B, proving to still have the legs that Chris Letang just might not. I get that Chris Letang was dealing with a myriad of injuries last season, but none of them seem to require any significant surgery. So who knows what that means going into next season with him health-wise. That's something to keep an eye on, to watch out for and see if he has any sort of decline. And then just moving forward, quite honestly, just looking into what Karlsson can do on his own and taking over as the number one defenseman. Yeah,
it's going to be one of the biggest storylines for everybody to watch throughout this season. Obviously, everybody knows where they stand going into the year. I would put Erik Karlsson as your number one defenseman. I think deployment, it's going to be pretty equal, with Karlsson taking the majority of power play time and Chris Letang probably taking a good bit of the penalty kill time. Let's close things out on this episode, because it is the eve of Sidney Crosby's birthday. Whatever that means for his contract, we will not know until tomorrow, but it is the eve of his 37th birthday. So we got to talk about him a little bit. We're going to give you the top 5 moments of Sidney Crosby's career. I'm going to list down my top 5. Horwat's going to pick it apart. Tell me what I missed, because I'm sure I missed one, because there's so many moments. It's tough to rank the top 5. I tried to do it. So let me, give you my top 5, and then you in the comments as well. Pick it apart, because that's what it's here for. Number 5, Winter Classic shootout winner in 2008 Winter Classic. This was the first mainstream moment for Sidney Crosby, really in the national eye, not just hockey, but this was the first of its kind, first event of its kind, really for anybody to see. And it was on New Year's Day. Everybody was watching. Sidney Crosby goes out with the game on his stick, as Doc Emmerich said. He was the marquee star in the first Winter Classic, and he ended the first Winter Classic with a shootout winner against Ryan Miller. Crazy, crazy visuals. One of the best moments of his career, bar none. I put that at number 5.
And that's a perfect spot for it. That's a good position. I had it on my list as well. Just a iconic moment with the snow swirling. Looked like a snow globe out there. You're right. The first, prominent outdoor game in the NHL's history, with the marquee star taking over it back when the shootout was still kind of cool too. I think that helped. That helped a lot for the moment. It helped that it was Sidney Crosby taking over. The game in itself was kind of a dud, but it was about the aesthetics. It was about the scene and the greatest player in the world at the time serving up one of the best moments that the NHL had to offer.
Mm-hmm. Now let's move over to number 4. At number 4 for Sidney Crosby, I have the 2016 Eastern Conference Finals, Game 2. Sidney Crosby takes a feed from Brian Rust, pots what is still to this day his only playoff overtime winning goal. That pulled the series even to 1-1. And imagine what happens if they don't win that game. Obviously, everybody knows, even with Andrei Vasilevsky in that series, because Ben Bishop went down in Game 1, the Tampa Bay Lightning were incredibly game in that series. In fact, they had a 3-2 series lead before the Penguins won Game 6 on the road and Game 7 at home with some more Brian Rust heroics. But imagine if they lose that game and go down 2-0 heading back to Tampa Bay. What happens in that series? Do the Penguins lose and not win the Cup in 2016? And if they don't win in 2016, what happens to them in 2017? Is there a domino effect where they don't win either of those Cups? And at that point, what happens to Sidney Crosby's legacy? That goal pulled the series even, a series that ended up coming down to the wire, 2-1 Game 7 victory for the Penguins. I think that is a underappreciated moment of Crosby's career. I think most people would highlight it as one of the better moments of his career, but the domino effect of what could have happened if he didn't score that goal. And it was an insane shot too, going against the grain, going over the blocker side, top shelf. If he didn't score that goal, what the domino effect could have been for his legacy, I put that as the top 5, and I actually put that at number 4.
I like that your domino effect is just big braining things of maybe things wouldn't have happened. And it's totally fair though, because let's say the Penguins don't win the Stanley Cup, obviously, in 2016. Who knows if that means Jim Rutherford makes different moves, decides to make certain moves that offseason. And maybe that just doesn't work out because it's the butterfly effect. Everything kind of lines up the way it does. I like this choice, actually. I think it's an underrated choice, too. It's one of the more, like you said, underappreciated moments. It's one that, especially if it stands at the end of his career as his only overtime playoff goal, then that's just one of those things you'll have to always look at.
Yeah, for sure. 100%. So let me know in the comments. How do you think I'm doing so far? Winter Classic shootout. Number 5, number 4, 2016 Eastern Conference Final overtime winner. Number 3, this one might get torn apart a little bit. Game 2 of a 2010 playoff series against the Ottawa Senators. The reason that I put this particular play in this particular moment at number 3 is because it highlights everything that Sidney Crosby does at his best. Penguins down 1-0 in that series. Game tied 1-1 with 5 minutes left. Crosby puts on a behind-the-net masterclass, having potential future Hall of Famer Jason Spezza look like a child. Back and forth, Spezza couldn't get the puck off of him. Puck protection, edge work, everything that Sidney Crosby is known to be one of the best, if not the best, in NHL history at being. He does that with 5 minutes left in a tie game down in the series to a team that, let's not forget, the first time these two teams met, the Ottawa Senators took down the Penguins in 5 games in Crosby's first playoff series. So there were a little bit of personal demons in there at this point. Instead, Crosby embarrasses Spezza, gets the puck up to Chris Letang. He scores the goal. The Penguins win the game. 2010 doesn't go great for the Pens. They win that series, but they do lose in the second round. But I do think that when you look at that specific play, it highlights everything that Sidney Crosby has done throughout his career and what he is best at that everybody needs to notice. It's a lot of the small things, and that play was a lot of the small things that led to a major goal that he didn't even put in the back of the net.
And I like that one too. It's one of those clips that continues to go around on the internet every so often. It's an easy choice. It made all the more fun that Jason Spezza works in the Penguins organization now too.
Yeah. It's great that those two probably have talked about that at some point in the past year, and probably before that as well. But Crosby had to say, you remember that time back in 2010? And Chris was probably like, yeah, I remember that. I was there. But it would be a lot of fun. So that's what I have as number 3 as far as the top 5 moments. Number 2, and this could have been number 1, his return goal versus the New York Islanders in November of 2011. Hard to put this one anywhere but the top 2. Hard to not put this one at the top. After missing 320 days with concussion-like symptoms, neck injuries, he scores an insane backhand goal just 5 minutes into the game, taking the puck over at the red line at center ice and just cutting through the New York Islanders defense before depositing it into the top of the net. He had the celebration that is still probably the most excited you've seen him in a non-playoff game ever. And he also added another goal and 2 assists on that night in the Penguins' victory over the Islanders. So number 2, his return backhand goal against the New York Islanders.
Like, again, hard to disagree. Oh, I thought I had something to say on it. It's just one of those moments. It's one of those poetic moments in hockey, not even just in Penguins hockey or in Sidney Crosby's career. It's one of the most poetic moments in the NHL's history. Just the star being taken down for almost a year exactly, coming back and within no time finding a way to get on the score sheet and then having a great game to follow. Just one of those perfect Sidney Crosby poetic moments for the league.
When you think of moments like Austin Matthews scoring 4 goals in his NHL debut, you think of the Lemieux return where he came in and scored that goal. This is one of those moments where when you look back at his career, this has to be in the highlight reel. This is, you can put any other goal in there. He's had several baseball bat goals early in his career. He had several goals where he went through 4 or 5 defensemen and he ended up putting it in the back of the net. This goal stands alone as far as top Penguins moments. To me, you can't go anywhere else but this one. And let's close things out with number 1. And I mentioned the return goal is the top Penguins moment. The best moment of Sidney Crosby's career, the highlight of his career, it's the golden goal. 2010 Winter Olympics, once again for the second time in this list, beats Ryan Miller. So a little underlying storyline there, but he clinches gold for Canada in Vancouver over the United States. It's a legendary moment that lives on not just in Crosby's lore, but really all of Hockey Canada and really all of hockey, where that is the crowning achievement of his career. Even though, I understand he won 3 Stanley Cups. When he won in 2009, he was the youngest captain to claim the Stanley Cup. I tried to keep just lifting the cup out of this because those are obviously fantastic moments. I wanted to keep it as moments that he created on the ice in real time. It's hard to go against the golden goal at number 1.
And I couldn't agree more. That was my number 1 choice too. It especially speaks loudly because we're having this discussion. I know it's not the same Olympics, but the Summer Olympics are going on right now. And pretty often you draw those comparisons of Olympic games. And it becomes front of mind every time, that sort of, that music plays, that Olympic music plays. Every time you see Team Canada in any sport for that matter, you understand that arguably one of the biggest moments in sports for Canada's history happened because of Sidney Crosby and what he was able to do at that specific moment. One of those moments that will live on forever, no matter what. It just will always stand the test of time, and because of the whole situation in Canada, playing against the United States in overtime, a couple of future Hall of Famers involved in it, and an assist from Jerome McGinley, or already Hall of Famer, and then maybe Ryan Miller one day. So it's, and then Crosby himself. It's just all lining up for one of the most perfect moments to ever grace hockey. I mean, that moment in itself, when you look at the grand scheme of just hockey moments, it's up there with the 1980 United States Olympic team as well.
Yeah, that's a tough one. That's a tough discussion. Not one that I want to get into at this particular moment in time. Maybe once the Four Nations face-off comes around, we'll have a couple of our friends from north of the border on, and we'll talk a little bit about 1980 versus 2010. But it's up there, but that's tough, man. That's a tough one. But top 5, according to me, which means you can tear this apart and everybody in the comments can tear this apart. That's perfectly fine. Number 5, Winter Classic Shootout winner, 2016 over number 4, 2016 Eastern Conference Finals overtime winner. Number 3, Game 2 assist versus the Sens, where he absolutely put on the Ritz on Jason Spezza. Number 2, his return goal against the New York Islanders in 2011. And number 1, of course, the golden goal. Is there any that you believe that I egregiously missed and didn't put on this list?
I don't have egregious ones. I have a couple of deep cuts that I want to sort of bring up, more or less because it's not just Crosby on the ice. I have a couple of, one very deep cut, and it's more personal. But I have 2 pretty deep cuts that are his off-ice moments. The first one I'll keep short and easy. At the end of last season, I asked him during one of his scrums how he felt about him and Malkin playing in 82 games for the first time in their careers. And just, we all know how Crosby is. His response was, I'd rather have 81 in a playoff appearance. So it's just that sort of that drive to win. He doesn't care about how many games he's playing in. As cool of an achievement as it was for the fans to see those two play together in every game in a single season for the first time ever, he didn't care that much. He just wanted to make the playoffs. Obviously, they didn't make it, but that was just sort of a personal little moment for me, I thought. And this is another one that recently went around Twitter just a couple days ago. But that Gord Miller story where he tells the one of Crosby taking the Stanley Cup to, I believe it's a veterans hospital in Montreal. And, you know, the blind man who was, you know, bedridden, I forget which war he fought in, but Gord Miller tells the story way better than I do. I'm just kind of summarizing for this moment. Everyone should know what I'm talking about, but tracing his finger over Maurice Richard's name, every time I hear the story, I get chills. And it's an off-ice moment, and goes to show that, you know, Sidney Crosby is more than just a hockey player. Yeah, obviously, everyone always talks about how great of a person he is, but he genuinely is one of the greatest humans that anyone has ever interacted with. So, yeah, great stuff on and off the ice from Sidney Crosby, and everything that we've listed. I just had to get at least the Gord Miller one in, and I don't know. I just thought it was a cool moment that, you know, I was able to ask him something like that, and I thought he gave a perfect response.
Yeah, if there was one response that kind of encapsulated Sidney Crosby, that's it. You know, team achievement over personal achievement. Cool that him and his best bud got to play 82 games together. Not cool that they didn't make the playoffs, and he would have sat out that last regular season game if that would have given them opportunity to go try to win Lord Stanley's Cup. So happy early birthday to Sidney Crosby. Let us know in the comments section, like I mentioned, if you think we missed any moments on ice or off the ice. Share any stories that you want, any anecdotes that you have about Sidney Crosby, because it is, you know, a day to celebrate Sir Sidney, a day to celebrate the captain, and hopefully we get some news in the next 24 hours. That would be pretty interesting if that came down the wire. And if we do, we will definitely talk about that at Tip of the Ice-Burgh on YouTube, as well as anywhere you get your podcast from. But that's going to do it for this episode of the Tip of the Ice-Burgh. Thank you guys so much for tuning into this one. We'll see you next time.